I died, and when I came back, everything changed. Father Michael had spent his life serving God, guiding others in faith. But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw on the other side. For 15 minutes, he was gone. No pulse, no breath. And in those moments beyond death, he stood face to face with Jesus himself. What he revealed to him will shake you to your core. Jesus didn't just show him the beauty of heaven, he gave him a warning, a chilling revelation about the world, about the path humanity is on, and about what's coming next. But here's the most terrifying part. Time is running out. Is this the sign you've been waiting for? Is this the moment you finally listen? Because one thing is certain. After you hear what Father Michael has to say, you'll never look at life the same way again. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more stories that could change your life. And tell me in the comments, do you believe in life after death? Let's dive in. Father Michael had always known his purpose. From the moment he first stepped into a church as a child, he felt something stir deep within him, a calling beyond mere words. He dedicated his life to the priesthood, embracing the vows of faith, service, and unwavering devotion to God. His days were filled with prayer, confessions, and guiding his parishioners through life's trials. He wasn't just a priest, he was a shepherd, tending to souls in search of meaning. And in that sacred duty, he found profound fulfillment. Mornings began before sunrise, with whispered prayers in the stillness of the chapel. Afternoons were spent visiting the sick, counseling the lost, and preparing sermons that he hoped would awaken something in the hearts of his flock. Nights were often spent in solitude, kneeling before the altar, seeking divine wisdom. He lived not for himself, but for others, a conduit of faith in a world growing increasingly disconnected from God. Yet, there were moments of doubt. He saw the dwindling numbers in his pews, the distracted glances during Mass, the confessions that spoke more of routine than true repentance. The world was changing, and faith seemed to be fading. Still, he pressed on, believing that his work was not in vain. He had to believe. His kindness was legendary in his small town. He never turned away a soul in need, never denied a listening ear. People sought him not just as a priest, but as a friend, a mentor, a father figure. God is always listening, he would say, placing a gentle hand on the shoulder of a troubled soul. But in the back of his mind, he often wondered, was anyone listening to God? Father Michael had no idea that his life of devotion was leading him to something far greater than he had ever imagined, that soon he would not only hear God, but stand before him. And when he did, the message he received would shake him to his very core. It was a morning like any other. Father Michael stood in the sacristy, preparing for daily Mass. The scent of burning incense lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of old wood and candle wax. He adjusted his vestments, smoothing out the fabric with practiced hands, his mind already focused on the sermon he would deliver. Outside, the early morning light streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the church interior with hues of gold and crimson. But then, something changed. A sudden, overwhelming heaviness settled over him, an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. His vision blurred, and for a moment he felt as if the world around him had shifted, tilting in a way that defied reason. A sharp, searing pain shot through his body, radiating from his heart like fire. His breath came in ragged gasps. He gripped the altar for support, but his strength was already failing him. The last thing he heard was the echo of his own heartbeat, hammering like a distant drum. before silence swallowed everything. His knees buckled, the wooden floor rushed up to meet him, and then darkness. A sacristan entered moments later, expecting to find Father Michael ready to begin Mass. Instead, she found him lying motionless, his face pale, his lips slightly parted, as if caught mid-prayer. Panic set in. A frantic call for help rang through the church, and soon paramedics arrived, their voices urgent, their hands working swiftly. But as they struggled to revive him, they didn't know one thing. Father Michael was already gone. His body remained in the church, but his soul, it had already begun its journey to the beyond. Father Michael expected nothingness. Instead, he became aware. A strange sensation washed over him. He was weightless, unbound, free. He could see the church, the paramedics working frantically over his lifeless body, their voices urgent but distant, like echoes in a vast canyon. He saw the sacristan standing nearby, hands clasped over her mouth in horror. Yet none of it felt real. It was as if he were an observer, floating just beyond the veil of existence. He tried to move, but there was no body to move. No arms, no legs, only his consciousness, drifting in a vast expanse of darkness. But it wasn't a frightening darkness. There was no terror, no pain, only an eerie stillness, like the moment before a storm. Time felt irrelevant. Seconds, minutes, hours, none of it mattered here. He was simply aware. A presence surrounded him, not visible, yet undeniable. It wasn't human, nor was it something he could comprehend with earthly understanding. It wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was a presence of knowing, of waiting. He sensed that something was coming, something beyond comprehension. And in that moment, he realized a truth that sent a shiver through his very soul. He was in the space between. The living world was behind him, but he had not yet crossed fully into the next. He felt no fear, only a growing anticipation. It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath. And then, in that deep, endless void, something changed. A light, distant but growing, emerged from the darkness. It wasn't blinding, it was inviting, radiating a warmth that beckoned him forward. He didn't walk. He didn't move. He was simply drawn. And as he drifted toward the light, he felt something shift within him. His very essence, his soul, responding to something greater than himself. The stillness was ending. Something, someone, was waiting for him. As Father Michael drifted closer to the radiant light, a warmth unlike anything he had ever known enveloped him. It wasn't just warmth, it was love, pure and absolute, pouring into every part of his being. It filled him, surrounded him, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly, utterly complete. It was as if every longing, every doubt, every fear had been stripped away, leaving only a deep, unshakable peace. The love wasn't distant or abstract. It was personal, intimate. He felt known, down to the very depths of his soul. Every mistake, every flaw, every failure was laid bare. Yet there was no judgment, only understanding. It was as if he had been loved all along, even in moments when he doubted himself, even in times when he felt unworthy. Tears, if he had a body to cry with, would have fallen freely. This love was not the conditional love of the world, the kind that fades or depends on circumstances. It was an eternal love, deeper than words, stronger than life itself. He had preached about God's love for years, but only now did he feel it in its fullest, most unfiltered form. It was overwhelming, breathtaking. If eternity was to be spent in this presence, then nothing else mattered. Then, something even more profound happened. The love around him spoke, not with words, but directly to his soul. It wasn't a voice, yet he understood. It said, "You are not alone. You never have been." The realization struck him like a tidal wave. Every lonely night, every silent prayer, every moment he thought he had been abandoned. He had never been alone. The presence had always been there, watching, waiting, loving. He wanted to stay. More than anything, he wanted to remain in this embrace, to surrender himself fully to this love. But even as he surrendered to the peace, he sensed something more. A presence within the presence. A power unlike anything he had ever known. And in the very heart of the light, he recognized it. Jesus was near. The light grew stronger, pulsing with a presence so powerful that Father Michael felt his very soul tremble. It wasn't the blinding light of the sun, nor the harsh glow of fire. It was a living light, pure and divine, radiating an authority beyond all understanding. And then, within it, he knew. He wasn't just in the presence of love. He was in the presence of Him, Jesus, but not as he had imagined Him, not as the paintings in his church depicted, not as a man in flowing robes. No, what stood before him was something far greater, a being of immeasurable brilliance, of indescribable majesty. He felt Jesus more than he saw him, an overwhelming presence that filled every space, every thought, every part of his existence. Jesus was not confined to form. He was. And yet, despite his infinite power, there was a gentleness, a familiarity, a kindness that made Father Michael's soul ache with both reverence and longing. He wanted to fall to his knees, to worship, to cry out, but he had no body, only his soul, trembling in awe. And then Jesus spoke, not with words, but directly into the core of his being. "My child, you have been faithful, but there is more to see, more to know." With those words, the light around him shifted. Images, visions, began to unfold before him. He saw the world, but not as he had seen it before. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the spiritual reality behind the physical. He saw the hearts of men, their struggles, their hidden pain. He saw the unseen forces that whispered lies into their ears, pulling them away from truth. He saw how many had strayed, how many had forgotten. And then he felt something unexpected. Sorrow, not his own, but Jesus. Jesus was weeping, not for himself, but for the world, for those who rejected him, for those lost in darkness, for those who had traded faith for fleeting distractions. The weight of it pressed into Father Michael's soul, deeper than any grief he had ever known. And yet, even in that sorrow, there was still love, an unfathomable, unshakable love. "There is still time," Jesus said, "but not for long." A chill ran through Father Michael's spirit. Something was coming. Something urgent, and he was about to see what it was. The visions came like a flood. One after another, they filled Father Michael's soul with an urgency unlike anything he had ever known. He saw cities brimming with life, yet spiritually hollow, millions of people consumed by distractions, their eyes glued to screens, their hearts distant from truth. He saw churches once filled with worship, now standing empty, their silence echoing with neglect. Faith, once the foundation of nations, was fading, replaced by pride, greed, and the illusion of self-sufficiency. He saw people who claimed to follow God, yet lived as though he did not exist. He saw prayers whispered without conviction, rituals performed without meaning, and hearts that had turned cold. And then he saw the darkness, not just the absence of light, but a living, creeping force that spread through the world like a disease. It whispered to leaders, sowing corruption. It entered homes, tearing families apart. It seeped into minds, twisting truth into deception. And worst of all, most didn't even realize it was happening. They do not see, Jesus' voice echoed, filled with sorrow. They do not hear. They do not know how close they are. Father Michael wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The weight of what he was witnessing pressed upon him. He saw the consequences of a world that had forgotten God. Chaos, confusion, a generation lost in search of meaning. He saw war looming on the horizon, not just of nations, but of souls. The battle was not coming. It had already begun. They must awaken, Jesus said, before it is too late. The words carried finality. This was not a warning to be ignored. Time was running out. And then, in a single moment, Father Michael saw something even more terrifying. A glimpse of what would happen if humanity did not return. A world where faith had been completely abandoned. A world plunged into darkness. He gasped, not with breath, but with his very soul. "Show them," Jesus commanded. "Tell them what you have seen." Father Michael felt it then, the responsibility, the burden. He had been sent here not just to witness, but to deliver the message. But how? How could he possibly return after experiencing such divine love? How could he go back to a world that was crumbling when he had just tasted eternity? And yet, he knew. He had no choice. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm Father Michael, the vision shifted. Amid the darkness, amid the fading faith and growing chaos, he saw something else. A spark. It was small at first, barely visible, but then another appeared, and another, and another. Tiny flames of light flickering against the vast shadows. They were people, ordinary people, praying, seeking, refusing to let the darkness consume them. He saw churches that had once been empty filling again, not with routine, not with obligation, but with genuine hunger for truth. He saw families gathering to pray, homes becoming sanctuaries of faith. He saw men and women standing boldly, refusing to be silenced, proclaiming the name of Jesus even in the face of persecution. "Not all are lost," Jesus spoke, his voice steady, filled with both sorrow and hope. "There are those who still seek. There are those who still believe. And through them, the fire will return." The sparks grew brighter, spreading across the world. He saw revivals, people falling to their knees, weeping, as the presence of God filled their hearts. He saw miracles unfolding, not just in churches, but in streets, in homes, in places where faith had once been abandoned. He saw the young rediscovering what the old had forgotten. The darkness had not won, not yet. But they must choose, Jesus said. They must turn back before it is too late. The door is still open, but it will not stay open forever. Father Michael felt a deep urgency. This was not just about faith. It was about time. The window was closing. The battle was raging. And the choice was being laid before every soul on earth. "Tell them," Jesus said. The vision began to fade. The light that had surrounded him, embraced him, began to pull away. He felt himself drifting, being pulled back toward the world he no longer belonged to. "Tell them before it is too late." As the vision faded, Father Michael felt a weight settle upon him. a burden heavier than anything he had ever carried. The message was clear, but so was the warning. Time was short. He had seen the future that awaited if humanity did not turn back, and now he bore the responsibility of delivering that truth. "Many are blind," Jesus spoke, his voice filled with both sorrow and urgency. "They do not see what is coming. They do not hear my call. They race toward destruction, unaware of how close they stand to the edge." Father Michael's soul trembled. He had witnessed the darkness creeping into the world, the spiritual decay, the deception that had taken root. But it was not just about corruption or faithlessness. It was about eternity. Millions were walking paths that led to separation from God, and they didn't even know it. "They believe there is still time," Jesus continued, "but the time is not theirs to decide." The words struck like lightning. How many lived as though tomorrow was guaranteed? How many postponed faith, thinking they could turn back later? But Jesus' voice carried an unmistakable finality. There was no later. The window of mercy was closing. Father Michael wanted to plead, to ask what could be done. But Jesus already knew his thoughts. "Tell them," he commanded. "Speak what you have seen. Some will listen, many will not, but speak anyway." The choice must be theirs. A deep sorrow filled Father Michael's soul. He knew the truth. Many would reject the message. Many would scoff, call it a dream, dismiss it as the ramblings of a man near death. But that didn't change the reality of what he had seen. He had been given a mission, and it was no longer a matter of his own will. "You must go back." The words sent a shock through his being. Go back? Back to the world he had just left? Back to pain, to suffering, to a body that had already died? Every part of him longed to stay, to remain in the presence of divine love, to never again feel the weight of earthly burdens. There is still work to be done. And with those words, the light around him began to fade. He felt himself being pulled, drawn away from the peace, the love, the warmth. He tried to resist, but it was useless. The decision had been made. The next thing he knew, he was falling. Back into the world. Back into the pain. Back into his body. Father Michael's soul resisted. Every fiber of his being longed to remain in the presence of Jesus, to bask in the overwhelming love that had filled him. But even as he tried to hold on to that divine light, he felt himself being drawn away, back toward the broken world he had left behind. "They need to hear," Jesus' voice echoed, steady yet firm. "You must tell them what you have seen." A deep sorrow filled Father Michael's spirit. How could he go back? How could he leave this perfect peace and return to a world filled with suffering, doubt, and rejection? He knew many would not believe him. He knew his message would be mocked, ignored, perhaps even silenced. And yet, the weight of his mission was undeniable. "But what if they do not listen?" his soul whispered, desperate for an answer. "Some will," Jesus replied, "and even if one soul turns back, it will have been worth it." Father Michael felt something stir within him, a sense of duty stronger than fear. He had spent his life in service to God, but now he had been entrusted with something far greater. This was not just about faith. It was about salvation, about eternity. The light around him began to shift. The warmth he had clung to started fading. He felt himself being pulled, his soul stretching between two realities, the peace of eternity and the burden of his calling. "Go," Jesus commanded, "and do not be silent." A force, powerful and irresistible, swept over him. He felt himself falling, not through space, not through time, but through existence itself. The divine love he had embraced only moments ago was slipping away, replaced by something heavier, denser. A distant sound began to emerge. Beeping, murmurs, the rustling of movement. His mission had begun. A sharp, searing pain jolted through Father Michael's chest. His body convulsed as air rushed into his lungs like a violent storm, reclaiming lost territory. His heart pounded, each beat echoing like a hammer striking against stone. He gasped, eyes flying open, blinded by the harsh fluorescent lights above him. Chaos surrounded him. Voices shouted in disbelief. Hands pressed against his body, checking, stabilizing. He heard the hurried beeping of hospital monitors, the shuffling of feet, the stunned murmurs of the medical staff. "He's back! My God, he's back!" Father Michael's vision swam, his mind caught between two realms. Just moments ago, he had stood in the presence of the divine. Now, he was trapped inside fragile, broken flesh, confined once again to the limits of the world he had left behind. The contrast was unbearable. He had tasted eternity, only to be thrust back into the temporary. A doctor leaned over him, his face a mask of shock and confusion. "Father Michael, can you hear me?" He could, but words felt distant, meaningless compared to what he had just experienced. His chest ached, his body felt heavy, foreign, like a prison holding his soul captive. Tears burned at the corners of his eyes, not from pain, but from loss. He had been sent back, and the burden of why weighed on him like a mountain. The nurse standing nearby clutched a rosary, whispering prayers under her breath, her hands trembling. "We lost him for nearly 15 minutes, she muttered in disbelief. 15 minutes? No, it had felt like an eternity. Then clarity struck him. The message, the warning, the urgency of Jesus' words. It wasn't about his pain or longing. It was about them, the world, the souls that were still lost, still blind to the truth. He had been given time, a second chance, and time was running out. Summoning every ounce of strength, he forced his lips to move, his voice hoarse but filled with an authority that did not come from him. "I have seen him," he whispered, "and I have a message to deliver." The church was silent. The congregation, packed from wall to wall, sat in stunned anticipation. Word had spread quickly. Father Michael had returned from the brink of death. But it wasn't just his survival that had drawn them here. It was the why. He had something to say, something urgent, something that burned within him with a fire he could not contain. He stepped up to the pulpit, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what he was about to reveal. He scanned the faces before him, believers, skeptics, the curious, the desperate. Some leaned forward, eager to hear. Others sat with arms crossed, waiting for some dramatic tale. He took a deep breath. "I died." His voice echoed through the vast sanctuary, steady, certain. "And I met Jesus." A murmur rippled through the crowd, gasps, whispers, a few skeptical chuckles. He let the words sink in before continuing. "I stood in his presence. I felt his love, a love beyond anything we can comprehend. But I was also shown something else." His voice tightened. A world consumed by distractions, a people turning away from God, a darkness creeping into hearts, into homes, into nations. Silence. Eyes widened. Even those who had come to scoff were now leaning in. "Jesus weeps for us," Father Michael continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Not because he has abandoned us, but because we have abandoned him. And he gave me a message, one I was sent back to deliver. He placed his hands firmly on the pulpit. There is still time, but not for long. A hush fell over the room, the weight of his words pressing down on every soul present. The door to grace is still open, but it is closing. He is calling, right now, at this very moment. But the question is, are we listening? Some in the crowd wiped away tears. Others bowed their heads in thought. A few sat frozen, as if the weight of eternity had just been laid before them. Father Michael took a deep breath, his next words carrying the full force of his mission. The time to return is now, not tomorrow, not someday, now. He stepped back, looking out at the sea of faces. Who among you will answer? Father Michael's message is clear. The time to return to God is now, not tomorrow, not when it's convenient, now. He saw the darkness spreading, the faith of millions fading, but he also saw hope, a chance for revival, a chance for salvation. But only if we choose to listen, only if we act before it's too late. What do you think? Do you believe Father Michael's experience was a true warning from Jesus? Or do you think the world is beyond saving? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because trust me, you'll want to hear the next one.